So to wrap up the last video, in order for the government to get a $2.5 billion autonomous effect, they actually need to lower taxes by $2.78 billion because people will only spend 90% of it. So they'll lower taxes by 2.78, people will spend 90% of that. That's a $2.5 billion autonomous effect. That would be the same effect that we see if the government spends money directly. That's why the government needs to use larger dollar amounts for tax policy than they would for spending policy. Now let's pick up with the complete model. And what we learned previously is that if the government is going to engage in expansionary fiscal policy, they're effectively going to be moving the aggregate demand curve to the right. Now in this illustration, we're going to be going from the autonomous effect to the total effect. So AD1 to AD2 will capture both the autonomous, the induced, giving us the complete shift. What's important though is to put our supply curves in this model. For example, let's say we start at point A. At point A, we have aggregate demand intersecting short-run aggregate supply at 17.2 trillion in real GDP and a price level of 108. Now, if we assume that potential GDP, that is where the long-run supply curve lines up, that's 17.4, then this short-run equilibrium here would be a level of output below potential. Well, that is a recession. And therefore, if the government is going to use activist policy to correct that recession, they're going to want to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And you know how they do that. One option is to increase spending. The other option is to lower taxes. Or you could do a combination of both. When they implement that policy, aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. Now look what happens. Ultimately, the goal is going to be to get from A to B. That is, we want that new aggregate demand curve to align with the short-run aggregate supply curve at potential. In essence, this short-run equilibrium A becomes this short-run equilibrium B because of the expansionary fiscal policy. That's the goal. What are the effects? Well, we see an increase in GDP, which means we come out of the recession, but we also see an increase in prices. So there's a trade-off here. Expansionary fiscal policy will help us recover from the recession, but it leads to inflation. Alternatively, let's look at this model here and say that we're at initially point A, where aggregate demand intersects short-run aggregate supply at 17.6 trillion in GDP and price level 112. In this case, we're above potential of 17.4. This is a boom. This is an economy that has high prices, inflation, as well as an unsustainable level of production. So the government might want to rein in this economy by implementing contractionary fiscal policy. How would they do that? Well, they could decrease spending, they could increase taxes, or a combination of both. Either way, aggregate demand is going to shift to the left, and hopefully we'll get to point B. Effectively, this short-run equilibrium, A, becomes this short-run equilibrium B. We get a contraction in the economy, but the economy was overheating. We were above potential, so that contraction is taking us back to what is healthy. And we also get a decrease in the price level, meaning that we deal with that inflation that was likely the cause of the contractionary fiscal policy at point A. Governments usually don't respond directly to a booming GDP. What they respond to is a booming GDP that's coming with high inflation, high prices. So they're trying to rein that in. But again, there's a trade-off. To get those prices down from 112 to 110, they're going to have to lower the economy back to potential. the party's over, in essence. Okay, so that's how we would illustrate fiscal policy in our aggregate demand and supply model. The key point is whether we use expansionary or contractionary policy, we're going to see changes in GDP and we're going to see changes in the price level. Now let's talk about the difference between fiscal policy and automatic stabilizers. Fiscal policy, we learned, involves changes in taxes and spending. But more specifically, these are changes that are under the control of the present administration, the president and Congress. There's issues with this. The first issue is what's called the expansionary bias. People in elected office are very quick to respond to recessions. When the economy is low in terms of production, when unemployment is high, they want to step in order to fix it. Because the things they would do to fix the economy are politically helpful to them. For example, in a recession, they get to raise spending and they get to lower taxes. Both of these are attractive to politicians. They help them get reelected and give them cachet among their constituents. This is called an expansionary bias, because the goal of good fiscal policy would be to stabilize the business cycle. That would mean that they would respond equally to recessions with fiscal policy as they would with booms and expansionary periods. But they don't. They respond to recessions by expanding the economy, but when we're in a boom, when inflation is creeping up but the economy is well above potential, they don't want to get involved because the things they have to do are not politically palatable. For example, in a boom, they would need to cut government spending and they would need to raise taxes. These are not helpful in getting reelected. So government officials are often hesitant to engage in contractionary policy, but raring to go when they can engage in expansionary policy. A famous economist, John Maynard Keynes, who built the model that we're studying of fiscal and monetary policy, he said that he doubted government officials would have the fortitude to do what was in the best interest of the economy, that their political motives would likely overtake their good judgment. So that's a true problem with fiscal policy. Another issue is timing delays. It takes time to get fiscal policy to actually work in the economy. There's what we call a legislative delay, which means if we go into a recession, the government has to agree on what policy to undertake. They have to agree on the tax cuts and the spending increases. The House of Representatives does, the Senate does, and then ultimately the president does. And that takes time. Implementation delays mean even once they agree, they have to go out and engage in the policy. If they're going to spend more, they have to go and buy the stuff and get that money flowing into the economy as new aggregate demand. If they're going to cut taxes, they need to send out the tax rebate checks or lower the tax rates. It takes time to achieve this, and that is a delay. And then the multiplier effects we just learned about. Multiplier effects don't happen over the course of a day or a week. The multiplier effects can take months or even years to fully play out. And that means that it's hard to predict when fiscal policy is actually going to have an impact on the economy. And we've learned before that the economy has its own kind of autoimmune system. It recovers without any policy. And imagine you have a recession and you go into it starting in January. Well, let's say the government doesn't even spot the recession until mid-year, because a recession takes 2 quarters in order to qualify as a recession. So we wouldn't know until June or July, at which point they would need to engage in legislation to get the fiscal policy approved. Now maybe we're in August. They would need to implement it. That may take us well into November. And then the multiplier effects might not occur until the following year. Well, we're long past the recession. It's possible the economy during all of these delays actually recovered. And once the fiscal policy hits, we end up trading a healthy economy that has recovered for a boom in inflation. These timing delays make fiscal policy really a last resort, whereas monetary policy can be implemented in a very strategic and tepid way. It's not going to have the kind of delays that fiscal policy does. And then there's crowding out. Crowding out is something we talked about in a prior section, where the government, in order to spend more and tax less, has to borrow money. They run deficits. And when they borrow money, they crowd out private sector borrowing. Another way of thinking about it is, if the government is spending more, then that increased spending may be at the cost of decreased private sector spending. If we put $2.5 billion in the economy in new government spending, it's possible that they actually crowded out upwards of $2.5 billion. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So there is another type of fiscal policy that has a stabilizing effect, but is outside the control of the present administration. These are programs that have been put into place in the past. And there's three big ones that I want to talk about here. Because the government has no direct control over these programs at any given time, they're operating in the background and therefore less subject to political whims as the discretionary type fiscal policy. The first program is welfare. If we go into a recession, welfare spending is automatically going to go up as people fall below the poverty line, and therefore we're going to see spending increase. That's automatic. No politician has to take initiative there, and it happens very quickly with almost no delay. So this automatic stabilizer helps attenuate the recession by getting money into the hands of people right away. Another one is unemployment insurance. As we go into a recession, unemployment is going to go up, but people are going to lose their job and qualify for unemployment checks. Happens again without any government involvement. It's automatic, and with almost no timing delays. That money flows very quickly into the hands of the people that need it. And then the progressive tax system. We have a system where the higher income you make, the higher percent of that income you pay in taxes. The thing is, when we go into a recession, the people make less money, and therefore they actually fall into a lower tax bracket. And therefore taxes automatically go down as incomes go down in a recession. Well, the fiscal policy that we would want during a recession is to lower taxes. It happens automatically without any government intervention. There's less issues with automatic stabilizers than the more discretionary type fiscal policy. You remove most of the political incentives, which creates a more consistent method of dealing with the recession. It also works the other way too. If we go into a boom in the economy, we already said that politicians don't want to step up and cut spending and raise taxes. Remember, they have an expansionary bias. But what happens when we go into a boom in the economy? Well, welfare payments go down because people get pushed above the poverty line. That's an automatic cut in spending without political consequences. Less people are on unemployment because they're getting jobs in a boom. So a lot of people lose their unemployment checks. Again, no political consequences for the current administration. And then the progressive tax system means that as incomes go up due to the boom, people are going to get pushed into a higher tax bracket. So taxes automatically go up. The nice thing about these automatic stabilizers is they work equally in both directions, truly attenuating the business cycle rather than only dealing with a recession and having an expansionary bias.